As I was taking pictures, I noticed something odd. A small laminated sheet pinned to the post next to the grill. I leaned in closer. It was an HOA event flyer. Community Lake Day, sponsored by HOA, hosted at Lakeside Park. Lakeside Park. That's what she was calling it now. And the event was scheduled for Sunday. Over 50 residents were expected. She'd even arranged for a food truck and a live acoustic band. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about lake access anymore. Marla was trying to rebrand my land entirely, to turn it into some kind of neighborhood amenity without even notifying me. I wasn't just fighting for privacy anymore. I was fighting to protect my legal ownership. I went back to my cabin, sat down at my desk, and looked over the documents one more time. Property survey, legal filings, photos, videos, everything was lined up. But just as I was about to send one final report to the county office, I got an email. It was from the HOA board. They were formally requesting I clear the area of any obstacles before Sunday's event. That's when I realized something else. This wasn't just Marla anymore. The whole HOA was in on it. It all came to a head on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon. I was working in the shed when I noticed a small group of people gathered near the lake, again clipboards in hand, pointing at the trees and talking in hushed voices. I recognized a few of them from the HOA board. This time, I didn't wait or wonder. I walked straight down and asked what was going on. One of them mumbled something about reassessing community boundaries and potential shared access rights. That's when I pulled out a copy of the county-approved survey, laminated and folded neatly in my back pocket, before they could walk away. I calmly informed them that I'd already submitted a formal complaint to the Land Commission regarding their activities. What they didn't know was that I'd also invited a reporter from the local paper to follow the story. And right on cue, she arrived with a camera crew just behind me. The HOA members went pale. The reporter started asking simple questions. Did you notify the landowner before assessing his private property? And do you have written approval for this access? They had no answers, only awkward silence and excuses as the cameras rolled. I laid out every document, property lines, complaint records, even drone footage of past encroachments. The story aired that same evening. By the next morning, my inbox was flooded with apologies, with support, and most surprisingly, with a certified letter. It was from Marla. In it, she confessed that the original access plan was never approved by the full HOA. She'd manipulated the board to push her own agenda. But here's the twist. She'd moved out of state weeks ago, and the letter was her way of finally letting go. In the end, the person who caused it all was already gone. Sunday morning came, and the HOA's Big Lake Day was already in full swing by the time I stepped outside. People were laughing, kids were running around. The food truck was parked just off the gravel path. All of it was happening on my land. Marla stood by the grill, grinning like she owned the place. But she didn't notice the county officials pulling up at the edge of the clearing, or the surveyor marking the flagged property lines, or the deputy sheriff walking toward her with a folder in hand. I didn't have to say a word. The cease and desist order, the property documents, the complaint filings, everything was official and backed by law. Within minutes, the music stopped, and the crowd grew quiet as the reality set in. Marla tried to argue, waving her hands and saying it was a misunderstanding. But the evidence was too clear. The county officer explained calmly that the HOA had overstepped every boundary literally and legally. One by one, people packed up their chairs and coolers and slowly walked back toward the street. Marla stood there, stunned, as the workers started removing the benches and equipment. The grill was disconnected. The signs were pulled down. By sunset, my land was mine again, quiet, undisturbed, peaceful. A few days later, I got a letter from the HOA board. Not an apology, but a notice. That Marla had stepped down from her position. No surprise there. Word spread fast, and neighbors started reaching out not to claim the lake, but to ask how they could support me going forward. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't act out of anger. I stayed patient, played it smart, and in the end, I didn't just get my property back. Reminded them all that respect, not entitlement, keeps a community together. The more pressure they put on me, the more they exposed just how little they understood about how things really worked behind the scenes. I knew, for instance, that our area had recently been up for a utility modernization grant, one that I had helped write a recommendation for. That grant was what was keeping rates low for the community. It was meant to cover upgrades that would have made the grid more efficient, especially during peak seasons. But here's the catch, continued. Eligibility depended on local cooperation and residential compliance with certain standards. And once I started pulling at those threads, well, let's just say it didn't take much for those standards to slip, especially when people started filing complaints and drawing attention to the internal dysfunction. Meanwhile, the board doubled down. They started inspecting other homes, issuing citations for tiny things like garden heights or mailbox colors, trying to show they were fair and consistent. But all they did was stir up more resentment. More homeowners started questioning them, showing up at meetings, and asking why their bills were suddenly creeping up, and I still hadn't touched the barn again. Not yet. It didn't take long before things started to boil over. By the third month's energy bills had spiked across the entire neighborhood. People were confused, frustrated, and starting to talk. I'd hear murmurs at the local coffee shop and at the grocery store folks, asking if anyone else's power bill nearly doubled. A few even thought it was a mistake. But it wasn't. It was just the result of a few planned efficiency upgrades being delayed indefinitely due to compliance concerns language I helped draft. Nothing illegal, nothing sneaky. Just policy doing what policy does when red tape gets pulled tight. At the same time, the HOA meetings got messier. Residents started pushing back, demanding answers. One woman, a single mom living 3 houses down, stood up and asked why she was being fined for having her trash bins out a few hours too early, while her electric bill had gone up 50%. The board gave her the usual runaround policy guidelines but people weren't buying it anymore. You could feel the tension rising like pressure in a sealed tank. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. Still hadn't picked up my hammer. Just went about my day like everything was fine. But inside, I was tracking every move. I watched as 3 of the 5 board members stopped showing up in person, switching to remote calls. Rumors started spreading that one of them was trying to sell their house. Another one apparently got flagged for making unauthorized improvements to their backyards, something they'd find others for. And just when it seemed like they were starting to sweat, the HOA sent me one final notice, an official cease and desist letter. They said if I touched the barn again, they'd escalate it to legal action. That's when I knew the next move had to count. A few days after I got that cease and desist letter, something strange happened. I came home from work and noticed tire tracks in the gravel that didn't match mine. At first, I brushed it off, maybe a delivery guy turned around in the driveway. But then I saw the side gate to the barn was unlatched. I always keep it locked. Always. When I walked over, I found one of the support beams I had leaned up against. The inside wall, tossed on the ground, snapped in half like someone had tried to break it deliberately. That's when it hit me someone had been snooping around. I didn't have proof, and I wasn't about to start making wild accusations. But it felt more like intimidation than coincidence. I made a report, changed the locks, and installed a couple of discreet security cameras. I figured if they were bold enough to threaten legal action, maybe they were bold enough to try something else, too. At the next HOA meeting, things completely unraveled. Residents were furious. Not just about utilities or nitpicky fines, but about a sudden special assessment fee the board announced to cover administrative costs related to non-compliance issues. People were yelling, walking out, demanding resignations. That's when a neighbor of mine, retired Air Force guy named Jim, stood up and dropped a bombshell. He had pulled the HOA's financial records under the state's public disclosure law and found a chunk of money spent on a private legal retainer. Turns out, they'd been quietly preparing to sue me, using neighborhood dues to fund it. Now the board wasn't just losing control, they were being questioned on everything. Trust was gone. And I knew, at that moment, this wasn't just about a barn anymore. It had turned into something much bigger. After that chaotic meeting, things moved fast. Within a week, nearly half the neighborhood had signed a petition demanding a vote to dissolve the current HOA board. People who had never even attended a meeting before were suddenly active, trading notes, sharing copies of fines, and comparing how far things had spiraled. The local news even picked up the story, Historic Barn Sparks Power Struggle in Suburban HOA. I didn't ask for the attention, but at that point, the spotlight was already there. Then something I never expected happened. One of the board members, the treasurer, reached out to me directly. She asked to meet in person. I was skeptical, but agreed. Public place, middle of the day. Over coffee, she admitted she hadn't agreed with how far things had gone. She had originally supported the complaint, thinking it was just a zoning thing, but had no idea they were planning to sue me or quietly adjust the budget to make it happen. She handed me a folder copies of emails, invoices, and internal memos. It was all the proof anyone needed. The neighborhood held an emergency vote. The board was removed. All of them. And just like that, the power shifted. Not just utility-wise, but in every sense of the word. The new interim committee reversed the fines, reinstated improvement approvals, and even offered me an apology. I finally went back to the barn, toolbox in hand, and got to work this time, no one standing in my way. But here's the twist. While sorting through old files in the barn storage room, I found something none of us expected: original land deeds and survey maps, proving the HOA had technically been managing a boundary they didn't own. Let's just say, that story is still unfolding. After I found those old land documents, I had them reviewed by a property lawyer just to be sure. Turned out several parts of the neighborhood, mainly the common areas and part of the walking trail, were technically on land my family had never signed over. No one had caught it because the original deeds were buried deep in county records. And most of the modern property lines were based on assumptions made decades ago. It wasn't a huge legal mess, but it was enough to shake things up and force a full reassessment of the HOA's control. In the end, the new leadership approached things with more transparency. They involved actual residents in decisions restructured the rules to make them fairer, and most importantly, stopped acting like they ran a gated kingdom. The special assessment fees were dropped. Energy rates returned to normal after the delayed upgrades were reinstated. And neighbors who had felt bullied finally started to speak up without fear of being targeted. As for me, the barn restoration is finally moving forward. It's slow work, but every nail and board feels like part of a bigger win. What started as a quiet weekend project became a full-blown fight for fairness and common sense. Funny how something as simple as fixing an old barn could stir up so much, but maybe it needed to happen. People got reminded that community isn't built through power plays, it's built through trust and respect. So yeah, it's a barn standing tall again, and this time it's more than just a building. It's a reminder that sometimes standing your ground even with a hammer in hand can be the start of something bigger, something worth fighting for.